My name is Gautam Mukunda. I'm a research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, but your bio program is sort of lying to you because I'm only there for 2 more days, where I moved to Yale on July 1st, where I'm going to be teaching at the School of Management. I'm also a senior advisor at the America's Frontier Fund, so I guess I'm a venture capitalist, but I still think of myself as a professor. And I've written a couple books. One was called Indispensable, When Leaders Really Matter, and the second was called Picking Presidents, which I hope is what you're interested in, because it is what I'm going to be talking about today. So I am congenitally dislike just kind of the 40-minute lecture. It's just not my thing. So here's my suggestion. I'm going to start talking. If I say something you find interesting, or you have a question, or you disagree with, or whatever, just stick your hand up. Andrew there in the back is going to get you a mic, and then we'll just start talking. And we're going to do the best I can to make this a conversation. Does that work for everybody? Awesome, okay, so let's get started. So everybody's heard the phrase, the most powerful person in the world. The President of the United States is the most powerful person in the world, right? And we hear that so often, I think we don't really think about what that means, right? So let's put this in context. The President of the United States has undisputed control over enough nuclear weapons to end human civilization in 30 minutes, right? They can wake up and do it. Okay, that's power, right? That's power at a level that it's kind of hard to comprehend. The President of the United States has enormous influence over the global economy, right? Food supplies, the climate, just any issue you name. There's literally nothing, no life of any human being on Earth that he's not touched, often profoundly, by decisions made at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Seriously, put that in context for a second. If I had told someone 200 years ago that there was someone in the world who could snuff out the human race, reach across the world and have someone killed, affect the climate, the level of the ocean, whether you could get a job whether you could feed your family and the crops, they would think I was talking about God, right? That's the scale of the power that we have allocated to one person, so far to one man. And it's what we, the American people, get to pick every 4 years, the person who exercises it. So I decided to dive into the question of how we pick presidents because of my first book, actually. So I'll just tell you very briefly that my first book was called Indispensable, When Leaders Really Matter. In it, I proposed a new theory about when leaders make a difference. Because here's the surprising thing about social scientists. I'm a political scientist by training, but social scientists in every field who have studied leadership. What they conclude is that leaders don't matter that much. That makes sense to anybody? Everybody surprised? You think all these smart people, all these professors who study leaders say leaders don't matter? How come? Well, there are 3 reasons. 1, leaders have external constraints, right? So if you are the CEO of a company and you want to raise prices, you might be able to, but if you do it too much, you're going to get undercut by your competitors, and then you can't. You have internal constraints, right? You have budgets and politics and culture and rivals within your organization, and all of those might stop you from doing anything you might want to do. But the most important reason that social scientists have said that leaders generally don't matter that much is because leaders are not selected randomly. They're selected through a process, especially if you've got a big, powerful organization. You get candidates and you get people who work their way up the ranks. And that process evaluates them, right? And it's looking at these people and saying, is this someone I want to take the next step? Is this someone I want to be the next CEO? Is this someone I want to be President of the United States one day? And if the people who make up that process say no, what's going to happen usually is you're going to get pushed out of the organization. The way I say it is these processes, they don't select winners, they select losers, right? They push people out over and over time, and they make the pool of people who might one day get the top job more and more homogeneous. So at the end of the day, when they finally pick the CEO, of the last 5 candidates, how different could they possibly be? They've all been evaluated for 30 years. If any of you have worked at a place like GE or Goldman Sachs or McKinsey, and I'm sure at Aspen Institute no one has been at any place like that, you're familiar with this process. That's what the process looks like. Right? You get pushed out. Nobody becomes the managing partner at McKinsey without having spent 25 years being evaluated. And believe me, McKinsey knows everything there is to know about you before you get that top job. Okay, so if that's why leaders don't matter, this could be a very short and boring talk. And obviously, I think they do. And so what I would say is, everything I just said to you is true, except when it isn't, right? Because if you believe what I just told you about when leaders don't matter, then you should also believe that when these things are not true, that leaders do matter. In particular, if the process that is selecting the leader has not gotten a chance to fully evaluate a candidate. Maybe it's because they came in from the outside, and you never know as much about an outsider as you do about an insider, right? Maybe it's because this person inherited the job, and you just don't have a chance to evaluate them. Maybe it's because all the other candidates, were eliminated because of a scandal or a plane crash. It doesn't matter. But if the leader who gets picked was not fully evaluated before they get the top job, then they have the potential to be very, very different from all the other people who could have gotten it. And because they are very, very different, they can make decisions that no one else would make. They can do things that only they would do. I would say that's when you as a leader have a high impact. It's when the difference between what you did, and what someone else in your shoes would have done is very large. Now, what do we know about these decisions? What do we know about these high impact, these unique decisions? So I would argue that what we know is that they are high variance, right? They tend to do either really well or really poorly. They're not usually boring. So let's say you're a company, you're not doing well, you're on the edge of bankruptcy, you're really struggling, and you decide to bring in an outsider CEO who you think might be able to rescue the company. And this person comes in, and you make them the CEO, and the first thing they do is push out the entire board of directors that just hired them. And the second thing is they handpick a new board of directors of people they have specifically chosen to be as compliant with their wishes as possible. Then they go to that new board and they say, I'm going to kill 70% of the products my company makes immediately. We're just going to stop making them. And the new board, that compliant handpicked board, says, no, that is way too radical. You should not do that. And he does it anyways. Are you optimistic about this person's CEO tenure? Not really? I got a lot of no's. Are you when I tell you his name is Steve Jobs? Okay. Second time, yes. So very high variance in outcomes, right? Do either well or really poorly. So that's the theory I proposed in my first book. It is, I think, a new way of thinking about leaders, where you'd realize that the best and the worst leaders actually have more in common than either of them does with normal leaders. Okay? But my editor, who was trying to sell a few books, said, look, Gotham, when I try to if you take this to a board of directors and you say this person will either bankrupt your company or save it, but I don't know which, that's not the most helpful advice you could give them. It's like fair. So my first book, which I really want to emphasize this, and it's important that you believe me. This book was published in 2012. Okay? I said, look, I think there are 4 characteristics, right? I can't tell you that someone will succeed for certain, because if I could do that, I wouldn't need this unique decision, right? I could just do that. I could just pick someone who would just do that. So I can't tell you for certain that someone will succeed, but I can tell you characteristics that make someone really likely to fail. Characteristics where if a candidate has any one of these 4, you should not allow them to get power, because it's just not worth the risk. And what these all have in common is these 4 characteristics are all things that make you look more impressive on first impression than you are over long run, right? So they create positive first impact, but have big negative costs in the long run. So these are the 4 characteristics I identify in the book as huge warning signs. Again, 2012. Psychological and personality disorders, where the examples I used were narcissism and sociopathy. Out of the mainstream are highly simplistic ideologies, an extremely risk-prone or incompetent managerial approach, and unearned advantages like inherited wealth. Yeah, so that happened. And so my editor called me after the election. He said, do you think people understood that we didn't mean this as a checklist? And I decided that I should probably write a second book focusing on the presidency. In particular, trying to understand, how do we evaluate presidential candidates, right? Can we create a system that anyone can use with publicly available information that is available at the time of the election to evaluate a presidential candidate and say, we're pretty confident that this person can do the job. Or alternatively, that we're pretty confident that this person can't do the job, and we should not allow them into the Oval Office, right? So that's what I set out to do in this second book. And that's what the rest of this is going to be about, right? So if you think about this unfiltered, filtered framework, the way I'd put it is, what that tells you is you can divide the 45 presidents who we've had, the 45 people who've been president, right, as into 4 categories. You could think of them as filtered successes, filtered failures, unfiltered successes, and unfiltered failures, right? So that's your 4 categories. Now, these are not my attributions. I'm not telling you that I think this person is a success or a failure. What I'm doing is American historians have this wonderful tradition where they rank presidents of the United States by performance. They do this roughly every 4 years. I wonder why. And so what they do when they do this right, is that they survey hundreds of historians and they create a consensus ranking. And the nice thing about these rankings is they are really good data, right? They are very stable over time. We've been doing these rankings for about 70 years, and they haven't changed much at all. In fact, the only really important change is that Dwight Eisenhower has shot up in the rankings over time. And interestingly, we actually know why. Fred Greenstein, a great political scientist at Princeton, published a wonderful book called The Hidden Hand Presidency, where he looked at the declassified National Security Council transcripts of the Eisenhower administration, and he said, a lot of the stuff that we thought he was lucky, he was just good. And so, to me, this actually gives you more confidence in the rankings, because it tells you that they actually update as we get new information, right? Historians haven't fixed in their minds, they're actually changing them. So the other criticism of the rankings is that historians are all liberal. So, I'm an academic, let me assure you that is true. Like, historians are mostly liberal. And so maybe it's being unfair to conservative presidents and Republican presidents. And so, perfectly valid critique. And so conservative historians got together and did their own rankings, and they came out exactly the same, right? Like Ronald Reagan was a bit higher. That's like basically the only difference. With the naked eye, you would not be able to tell which one is which. So I'll start this by saying I did a statistical analysis of these rankings, and what I essentially did was say if you coded all of the presidents by how filtered they were, you should say the less filtered a candidate is, the more likely it would be that they were at the top and the bottom of the rankings. And this was statistically significant at over the 99% level. Those of you who know stats know that when you're talking about 45 data points, getting a 99% significance level is it's unlikely, right? It just doesn't happen very often. And so that should tell you that you've got a pretty strong evidence that something really interesting is happening here, right? That this theory is not just shooting in the dark. Okay, so I'm not going to spend any time on the filtered successes because that's the normal. If you want to, ask me questions about them, I'm happy to do that. But okay.
You say filtered. What does that mean?
So that's a great question. So, just you want to repeat your question?
You said filtered. What does that mean?
So it means fully evaluated by the political system. So when I say filtered, I want you to think George H.W. Bush, right? When George H.W. Bush got elected president of the United States, everyone knew exactly what they were getting. You may not have liked it, you may not have wanted it, but you weren't surprised, right? George H.W. Bush had been a member of Congress, he'd been director of the CIA, he'd been chairman of the Republican National Committee, he'd been ambassador to China, he had been vice president of the United States. This guy had been at the upper levels of the American government for forever, right? And so he was filtered. And so when you think about a filtered candidate, yeah, we will get to him, yes. When you think about a filtered candidate, right, this is what you should think, good but not great. Really capable at executing on the levers of government and what it takes to succeed as president, but maybe not going to transform the country in a way that someone else might have, right? So, but good not great is a good standard, right? I want you to start with the bias that this is where we should be. Right? Because again, think about the stakes. I think of electing a president, it's kind of like being CEO of a bank, my friend Bob, right? It's like the first thing you need to do is not screw up, right? Like being the greatest banker of all time is awesome, but your first responsibility is don't blow up, right? That's the non-negotiable. For the presidency, there's nothing in the world that has the stakes as high, right? So your first responsibility is no disasters. No disasters, right? That's what we need more than anything else. Then we start to look, if you can get Abraham Lincoln, that's great, but start with your floor, then look at the ceiling, okay? So George H.W. Bush, Joe Biden, you can all think of other examples. That's like our default president, right? The president from Central Casting, a filtered success. Okay, filtered failure. I think this is in some ways the most interesting one, right? Like, how do you get someone who's so evaluated and then they're just a disaster? Okay? So my case study for that is James Buchanan. Okay? James Buchanan is the president before the Civil War, the president who takes us into Civil War. Up until Joe Biden, he was the most experienced person ever elected president, right? The most filtered person ever elected president. I rank filtration by number of years in like senior political office. So think member of Congress, Senate, cabinet, governor, flag rank officer in the US military, things like that. Like it's sort of the things that you're thinking of, right? There are no surprises here. James Buchanan had 24 years in these offices. Again, of anyone who've ever elected president, the record up until Joe Biden. He had been in public politics for so long that his nickname, you gotta love the 19th century, all politicians had nicknames, was the old public functionary, right? So Buchanan becomes president of the United States and leads the country into civil war, right? This is the failing grade. Civil war is as bad as you're gonna get, right? Like, yeah. So what happened? The answer is Buchanan spent his 4 years in the White House giving the South everything it wanted. He was the most pro-Southern president it was possible to imagine. Even though he was from Pennsylvania, Buchanan described himself as a Northern man with Southern principles, right? The term of the era was doughface. He was a doughface, right? So why was Buchanan like this? And the answer was he had to be. The rule in the Democratic Party was that to become the nominee, you had to get 2/3, not a majority, 2/3 of the delegates. Southern states accounted for more than 1/3 of the delegates in the convention. So you could not become the Democratic nominee without Southern support. It literally mathematically could not be done, right? So if you are an ambitious Democratic politician who wants to be president of the United States, what do? You secure your Southern flank. And you create essentially a race to the Southern position, right? And like we tend to forget a fair amount what that actually meant by the 1850s, right? Well, like what we're talking about, and it's worth bringing that out, okay? So Americans, we're taught about the founding fathers' attitudes towards slavery, which is they didn't like it, right? Like that's not to understate the hypocrisy, right? Obviously, Jefferson, Washington owned slaves. If you erased the slaveholders from like the founding fathers, you wouldn't have too many of them left, right? But the intellectual consensus of the era was that slavery was bad and on its way out, right? Jefferson was like enough of a hypocrite to like not actually free his slaves, which, but at least he knew it was the wrong thing. That was not the attitude in the 1850s South. It was not. By the 1850s, the Southern intellectualism was what we call the pro-slavery movement, okay? Where the slavery was not just a regrettable thing, it was an actively good feature of Southern society that enabled the creation of a more elevated aristocracy. They called this the mudsill theory, where you would step on the mudsill to raise yourself up higher. I guess you don't want to be the person who's being stepped on, but that wasn't their problem. And so to be pro-Southern did not mean just allowing slavery to go on in the South. It meant aiding in the expansion of slavery across the Union. And that, of course, is what we saw under Buchanan, right? In Bleeding Kansas, the real start of the Civil War, a guerrilla war in Kansas that really was essentially fighting over slavery that included massacres, towns being burned down, the real thing. And of course, the worst Supreme Court decision in history, Dred Scott, where we now know, right? We now know that James Buchanan unconstitutionally intervened to lobby Supreme Court justices in favor of the Dred Scott decision. Okay? Now, this is it. This is the worst president, in American history. But my position is, right, it's not Buchanan's fault. By which what I mean is, if it had not been James Buchanan, it would have just been another pro-doughface Democrat, right? Because he was picked to do what he did. The system wanted the most pro-Southern possible president, and that's what it got. So what is this? This is when the system fails, right? The system fails when it is captured by a single interest group that has so much power that it is able to essentially pervert the system on its own behalf, right? You can think of the basic coin of the realm of politics as the distribution of goods and power, right? Like you get elected and then you kind of get to hand out stuff. And what we would like is for the president and the people we elect to distribute power and goods evenly, whether or not you were their supporter, right? Like you are supposed to represent the country as a whole. In fact, the presidency, right, the unique thing about the presidency in the American political system is the president is the only person elected by the people as a whole, right? Everybody else has a district or a state. The president has all of us. So that's the idea. But interest groups, of course, they always want more. That's their job. That's not a criticism. If you're the leader of an interest group, your job is to want more for your interest group, right? But if you get powerful enough or you have a strategic enough position, you can not just get more than you maybe deserve, you can keep escalating those demands. And that's what we saw in the South leading up to the Civil War. Not just that they were getting goods for themselves, but the demands kept escalating, right? From leave slavery alone, to allow slavery to expand into the southern territories, to make slavery nationwide, right? The demands kept escalating. And that happened until the system broke. And the Civil War is how the system broke. Okay? So this is not just a phenomenon of American politics, I'll just note. If you want an explanation for how World War I happened, this is a pretty good explanation for German thinking before the First World War, where the German military was enormously dominant in German society and lobbied constantly for more military funding, for more support for German militarized foreign policy, right? So the great German strategic fear before the First World War was that they would fight a two-front war, right, on the East and the West. That was what they were terrified of. And the way they dealt with that fear was by starting it, right? This is not great strategic thinking, but it makes sense if the only solution you can imagine is a military one, right? And if the only reason you can imagine that, the only solution you can imagine is that, is because the German military establishment, in particular, by the way, weirdly, the Navy, not the Army, which was bigger than our Navy, is so dominating your intellectual discussion that they have captured the marketplace of ideas. And you cannot even enter in that maybe the best way to avoid a two-front war is to not fight it instead of winning it. Right? So this is what happened in the United States in the 1850s, and the system collapsed. And it took Abraham Lincoln to save it. Okay. So then we've done both. What's a filtered failure look like? I always want to do this order because I don't want to end on filtered failure because it's just too depressing. So what does a filtered failure look like? Right? So what does an unfiltered failure look like? So unfiltered failure, right, is someone who hasn't been evaluated, who when they get to the top job, it just falls apart, right? And sadly, we can come up with a fair number of examples on that. In my first book, I did Woodrow Wilson, right? So I have a quite low opinion of Woodrow Wilson that historians are coming to share. But for this second book and for this talk, let me do Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was the worst president in American history. And this is my opinion, and the rankings usually comes in second, so I'm not that far off from the historians. But what I would say is Andrew Johnson was bad in a consequential way, in a way that James Buchanan wasn't, right? Because Andrew Johnson was the guy who replaced Abraham Lincoln. So your wins above replacement is pretty high, right? Like when your counterfactual is Abraham Lincoln, well, okay, I feel sorry for anybody who has to fill those shoes. But Andrew Johnson in particular is a catastrophe. So Johnson becomes president because Lincoln in 1864 is really, really concerned that he's not going to get reelected. And in fact, thought that he was likely not to be reelected. And so what he decided to do was to pick what he called a war Democrat, right? So Andrew Johnson was the only Southern senator who stayed with the Union after secession. We should give him credit for that, right? The only one. That's pretty impressive. And so he got picked, and Lincoln ran not as a Republican, but under the Constitutional Union ticket, as a hope of getting Democratic support for his election. Now it turns out he didn't need it. He probably would have won without Johnson anyways. But that's what we got. We got Andrew Johnson, and then Lincoln is assassinated, and Johnson becomes president. What's the problem here? Johnson was from a poor Southerner, right? He grew up dirt poor, really, really dirt poor, and ended up and so what he got from that first was he hated the Southern planter aristocracy, hated it with a holy fire, right? And so that was why he stayed with the Union, because he blamed correctly the Southern planter aristocracy for taking the South into the war, and he was not going to line up with them. The problem, as it was revealed once he became president, is that his vision for the post-war Union was that the South would be exactly the same as it was before slavery, just with the word slavery abolished, right? But the social structure of the South would remain entirely unchanged. That's what Andrew Johnson wanted. And he did this in a time when the radical Republicans who were controlling the government other than him were radical in a way that it's actually pretty hard for us to, when you really look at the history of Reconstruction, it is shocking just how modern their attitudes towards race actually were, right? They really passed the 14th and 15th Amendments and as an attempt to guarantee civil rights for blacks in the South, blacks in the nationwide and in the South in particular. They really wanted that. And in fact, the South had been so catastrophically defeated by the Civil War that, and this is, I'm drawing on the research of my brilliant colleague, Annette Gordon-Reed, the Harvard historian here, where she demonstrated enormously persuasively, convincingly, that the South had said, we are going to accept political equality for blacks because we lost. And we lost so devastatingly that we just have to take whatever terms that they're offering us because we can't, we tried our best and we were just destroyed. And Andrew Johnson comes in, what does he do? He gives them hope, right? Hope that even though they lost the war, they could win the peace. And that's what happened. Who was the first black senator? Hiram Revels, 1875, Mississippi. There was one other during Reconstruction. Who was the next black senator? Someone here probably knew him. Brooks. When? Yeah, when? Huh? 1960. But yeah, 90 years later, right? If you were an African American in 1875, you had better rights in the United States than you did as an African American in 1950. It's not close. Okay? Andrew Johnson, by himself, set the progress of civil rights in the United States back by a century. He squandered the fruits of the Civil War. And it was one disastrous president. Okay? So what do we say? So Johnson had other flaws as well, which led to this. For example, he was such a severe alcoholic that he was like visibly and publicly drunk during his own inauguration. Like, I don't recommend that. So what do we learn from this, right? So what you want to do if you're looking at a president, an unfiltered candidate, right? The first thing is, with filtered candidates, you have confidence, right? The system has done the job of evaluating for you. And so what you basically are doing when you're looking at a filtered candidate is you're evaluating the system. Is the system broken? Is it so broken, so captured by one individual interest that you're better off gambling on someone unfiltered than going with that thing? But most of the time, that's not true, right? Most of the system's not working and the system broken are different things, right? So most of the time, that's not true. If you're looking at an unfiltered person, the first thing you want to do is you want to avoid what I call like red lights. Just like things that say, you can't trust this person with power, right? Remember, everything we're talking about here, we're talking about power, right? Power. Having power is one of the most profound experiences a human being can undergo. It will change who you are. There are many people in this room who have experienced that in person, right? Like, you know this from your own experiences. But let me tell you what the research says. What we find is that when we give people power, they tend to become, about 90% of the time, worse people. It's just that simple, right? They become more aggressive, more Machiavellian, more sexually aggressive, more willing to use others on their own behalf. Like there's no characteristic of human ethical behavior on which about 90% of people don't get worse when they get power, right? And by the way, this is how easily we create that effect. We ask people to write about a time that you felt powerful. Obviously, in the lab, I can't actually give people power. The IRB tends to veto when I ask for that. So I just make them remember feeling powerful, and they become like less empathetic to their fellow man. Okay? Think about how much more important that effect is when you're doing it for real, right? When it's not just in a lab. Interestingly enough, right, there's 10% of people who go the opposite direction. Power makes them more empathetic, more ethical, more altruistic, more community-oriented, more honest. What we think seems to be the driver there is they view themselves, their identity is centered on their thinking of themselves as ethical actors. right? So the center of their self-conception is they are people who do the right thing, right? And so what power does, so you often hear people say power is a moderating force, right? Like we'll give power to this insurgent group in this territory, and then they have to get the garbage clean, and power will moderate them. And this is totally untrue. Power is not a moderating force. Power is a liberating force. Power allows you to be the person you want to be and you actually are underneath, but aren't able to be because you want power. Okay? And once you have it, you use it. And it turns out 90% of people, not that great, and 10% of people actually become better. Yes?
I wonder, based on your research, is there a correlation between that 10% and those who historians have deemed successful?
I hope so. I think so. The problem is I can't get into their heads and tell you how they identified, right? My pick for the religious figures accepted, the greatest human being who's ever lived, Abraham Lincoln, 100%. He's like the living definition of this, right? Like you can go back to his childhood and find stories of Lincoln acting in a deeply ethical, principled, compassionate manner that has no relationship to the arena, to the norms of his era. So, for example, growing up on the frontier was tough, right? Not just tough in terms of the environment, the people were tough, and so torturing animals for sport was just kind of a thing, right? I know everyone here is kind of recoiling at the idea of that. We find that to be horrifying, but that was just entertainment in 1830s America. And we have multiple stories of people in Lincoln's era, who grew up around Lincoln, who when he would see this, he would put a stop. He would physically put a stop to it. If he had to get into a fight with someone to stop it, he would do that. But he could not bear to see the pain of an animal. Now, nowadays you might say that, well, that's not that out of the ordinary. But in those days, that was really out of the ordinary. And it just seems to have gone through his life, this central thread. I'm biased. I have a bust of Lincoln in my office. I think he's the greatest person ever. But I would genuinely say I cannot find an action in his life that I would attribute to malice. Right? He just seems to have lived this, so I do think that is a big part of it. Tom.
Is there something going on now though with social media, where it is much easier for an unfiltered person, maybe Trump was the first, to gain high office in ways that could be dangerous for a democracy?
I would give you the worst of all possible answers to that question. I don't know. And the reason for that is because the American political system is uniquely prone to picking unfiltered leaders, right? So I in my first book, I used a threshold test, right? I said if you would spend 8 years or fewer in senior political office, you were unfiltered, and if you'd spent more than that, you were filtered. We split 50-50 by that metric, right? Let me put this in perspective. If you use for filtration number of years in Parliament in Britain, which I think is a good proxy, who is the least, so the modern British political system dates to 1832. Anybody want to tell me who the least filtered British prime minister since 1832 is? I will be shocked if, We got Johnson, Thatcher. Okay, I'm pretty sure it's not Johnson, but when I did this research was before the current craziness. So I'm gonna terminate this with Tony Blair, before Tony Blair. Anybody know? No, Churchill's actually the opposite. Churchill has the record for the most offices held by any person. It's John Major. I am the only person in history to use the phrase the meteoric rise of John Major, right? But John Major had 14 years in Parliament before he became Prime Minister. That would put him at dead last in British prime ministers and in the upper quarter of American presidents. Johan.
Ethical and unethical isn't, in my experience, there are quite a few that are in between. So for me, ethical is on the big decisions in order to implement and wield power, is also unethical in many other aspects. So it's like the more blurry of a blurry line.
So I think that's exactly right. So for the 10% is from lab studies, right? So the problem with lab studies that we always say is external validity. I can replicate that number in the lab, it's pretty reliable, but I don't know how well it replicates outside the lab, right? Maybe getting power out to the lab causes you to act, causes the ratios to act differently. My bet is it's, like 10% may be harsh, but I'd be a little shocked if it's 25. And we're also talking, the second thing I remember is, for most of the people we're talking about when we talk about at the summit of the system, they've had power for a long time, right? Like you're talking about presidents who used to be senators, right? So a lot of the effect that we're seeing when you're talking, especially when you're talking about filtered leaders, is already baked in. It's the unfiltered ones who maybe have not had a lot of power who that effect might be very, very large indeed. The second one is I absolutely agree with you about the tactical versus the question. So my classic example of that is, again, George H.W. Bush, who I think was a pretty ethical president, but who famously ran really nasty campaigns, right? I mean, like really nasty campaigns. It's shockingly so when you look back in history. The '88 presidential campaign is sort of legendarily this like really ugly, nonsensical campaign, and that was George H.W. who drove that, and he won overwhelmingly. So I think that's true, and so but what I would say is, your internal dispositions tend to shape all your decisions, right? So if you are a person who is incredibly willing to use others for your own behalf, it makes it easier to get elected, but most of the time it's not going to stop there, right? So I agree with you that there are people who have this, in particular, like Bush, like I don't want to, but it's a waspy conception of like the difference between campaigning and governing. I'll note, I don't think that breakdown is nearly as reliable as the one that says that actually behaviors tend to be more of a continuum than a binary split. If that's an answer.
Yeah, although also within governing, there are the issues that you're saying, okay, this is not the big issue, so I'll be more cynical on that, and then ethical on the big issue.
I would say about that is, I hope so. I think a lot of people think that way, but it is a very dangerous way to think, a really dangerous way to think. So, there's a weird HBS tradition that the last day of class you like give a lecture with your wisdom for your students going forward. My first few years as a professor, most of my students were older than I was, so I was like questioned whether I had wisdom that was all that. But what I said to them was, look, I'm pretty sure none of you guys are going to end up poor. But statistically, one of you is going to end up in jail, and like let's try to stop that from happening. It's like, how do people go wrong? And my answer was that character does not break; it erodes, right? It is the people making, when you make a decision that's, I would call it somewhat cynical decision, like I'm going to do the wrong thing here because it's a small thing. What we know about people's identities, right, is that they are formed by their actions. So your identity shifts into someone who is able to do that. And it makes doing the next wrong thing easier and easier until finally you end up as Jeff Skilling. And so I agree with you that many people think that way, but I think they're probably making a mistake when they do. That's the way I put it. All right, so I got less than 10 minutes, so we're going to move a little bit quickly. Unfiltered, right? What do I want to avoid? You want to avoid negative signals. So the biggest one here is the dark triad, right? So the dark triad is the set of 3 characteristics that tend to be comorbid. They tend to appear at the same time, which is why we call them the triad. Narcissism, sociopathy, Machiavellianism. They are what they sound like, yeah. The thing these 3 things have in common is when you first meet someone with these traits, they seem really impressive, okay? In fiction, we have a character who perfectly embodies them. James Bond. James Bond, dark triad, to a T, right? Narcissists, for example, if you put a bunch of people in a room and ask them to vote for who should be the leader, they tend to vote for the most narcissistic person in the group, because narcissists are so convinced that they're awesome that you kind of tend to think so too, until you have to live with them for a while and realize, oh God, no. Right? So dark triad is really, yes?
I have a question about the dark triad. because you started off with the you start off with the Steve Jobs example, and I think there's a lot in the literature about how people with the dark triad, they might be a mess in their personal lives, but sometimes, you know, they have done amazing things in the business world and in the political world as well. So I just want to get a sense of why you think it's a kind of disqualifier for a leader.
So this is exactly that. This is the problem of selection effects, right? They absolutely sometimes do amazing things. Would you want to bet in that direction, right? What I would argue is the dark triad is a big sign that unless you have other really positive signs, and we'll get to that, you really want to stay away because the dangers are so high. Can you maybe slide through, and I'll get back to you? Okay, dark triad's a really bad one. Second is the presidency. I'm particularly talking about the presidency, but you know, could be a leader of any organization. It's hard, right? It's really hard. Most people just can't do it. Like, we're not supposed to be elitist and say that. We're supposed to be non-elitist and say anybody can't do it. These jobs are really hard, okay? The greatest reward of status is longer life, right? The higher your status, the longer you live. If you win the Nobel Prize, you will on average live about 3 years longer than someone who was nominated for the Nobel Prize but did not win it, which is real incentive, and everybody get to work on that physics research. But if you get elected president, you will on average not live as long as the person you beat. And the only explanation we can come up with is stress, right? These jobs are hard and not everyone can do it. The great psychologist Dean Keith Simonton looked at leaders across a wide variety of domains, and also the presidency, and what he found is the most consistent, in fact, the only consistent individual level predictor of success was what he called intellectual brilliance. Not just IQ, creativity, insight, breadth of ideas, things like that, you know, like speaking lots of languages, writing lots of books, okay? So you want to avoid the negatives, like the dark triad, and you want to seek out the positives, right? Like intellectual brilliance. Unfiltered successes. Flip it around, right? You want to avoid the negative signs and seek out people who have extra values of the positive signs. Abraham Lincoln, 6 months of formal education his entire life, and you know, among many, many other things, the greatest writer ever to occupy the Oval Office, right? Pretty impressive. Theodore Roosevelt wrote 14 books by the time he became president of the United States, several of which are still to this day considered all-time classics. Pretty remarkable, right? Became president of the United States because William McKinley was assassinated. Why was he vice president? He was vice president because as an anti-corruption governor of New York, he had been such a problem to the established interests, they said, hey, we need to put him somewhere that is totally useless, where he can do no harm. I know, the vice presidency, right? So that was how he became president of the United States. He had been filtered out and then was brought back in. And Theodore Roosevelt incarnates, right? Intellectual brilliance, creativity. The last thing I'd say you should really want to look for in unfiltered candidates, your big positive sign, is handicaps, right? So if unearned advantages are a big negative sign, because, right, what does it do? An unearned advantages eliminates our ability to judge someone's capability properly. If you, right, we always say experience. We talk about learning from experience, right? You should learn from experience. I'm in favor of it, right? That is conceptualizing experience as a developmental process. But experience is also a revelatory process, right? You undergo the experience, and we watch you, and we learn about you. And we're able to learn more about your capabilities and your beliefs and your preferences. But if your family is so well connected that they can pull strings to make sure you get promoted every time you screw up, we have short-circuited the revelatory component of experience. So that's the negative. But on the positive, if you are, right, if you came from poverty, if you are from a discriminated against minority, right, if you are a woman in pretty much every major career path, it's just harder to get to the top. And if you think it isn't, go take a look at the demographics of Fortune 500 CEOs and come up with an explanation for me, right? It's just harder. So we should believe that these people have intrinsic capabilities that are larger because they were able to overcome these handicaps, right? If you can win a 100-yard dash when you're wearing a weighted vest, think about how fast you must be when the vest comes off. So unfiltered leaders, we want to say no one who has any of the negative signs, and we want to look for people who have these signs of strength. Okay, I got 5 minutes? Okay, so Joe Biden, you mentioned. Joe Biden broke my graphs. I had all these nice graphs in my book of how filtered you were, and my record was 24, and Joe Biden had a filtration score of 44. He is the most filtered person ever to be elected president of the United States. And in fact, if you combine any two people who had ever been elected president of the United States, he's more filtered than they are. So that's Joe Biden. Donald Trump, he does have a stutter, actually, which is actually, I had never thought of that. This is my wife, everybody, who's the smarter part. And I had never thought of that, and you should have told me before now. But yeah. But yes, stutter is actually a really good indicator, right? Think about how much harder it is to succeed in politics when you have a stutter. Oh my God. Wow, yeah. Okay. Donald Trump. Do I need to do Donald Trump? Okay. Yeah, sure. Poor family, single mother, black, first black African-American editor of Harvard Law Review. Wrote 2 books, one of which is a campaign book, fine. The other one of which, Dreams from My Father, is extraordinary. Yeah, of course unfiltered. Sorry, okay. I got to do this because it's so much fun. 7 of 9 is why Barack Obama became president of the United States. You all think I'm crazy. 7 of 9 was the Star Trek character played by Jerry Ryan. Jerry Ryan's husband was supposed to be Barack Obama's Republican opponent in the Illinois Senate race. He had to withdraw from that race because it came out from their divorce settlement that there was all sorts of bad stuff in their relationship, and he withdrew, and Barack Obama ran, not unopposed, but not against a credible candidate, and won easily. Had it not gone that way, he might well not have run that race. Because 7 of 9 is how Barack Obama became president of the United States. I'm not kidding. Which should tell you how random the process is, right? In Barack Obama's case, when he got elected president, he had been senator for 2.5 years. Well, he started running, sorry. When he'd been senator for 4, started running, he'd been president for 2.5 years. Right? We didn't know anything about this guy, but we knew that he was smart. We knew he was from a tough background. We had a lot of indicators that if we did get him in, he would make it, right? He would do well. So what would I do to change things, right? So given all this, I've given you a framework. It's laid out in the book in more detail, but how you can evaluate people. Institutionally, what should we do to change things, right? So first, we should shrink the powers of the presidency in certain specific ways. The president should not have the ability to unilaterally use nuclear weapons. Absolutely, unimaginably irresponsible to give one person this capacity. The American military is very good at its job. If it actually needs American nuclear weapons to bail it out, the president can get that authority when he or she needs it. The idea that the president should be able to just wake up in the morning and decide to launch, ridiculous. I'm sorry, it is ridiculous. The ability to declare states of emergency without congressional authorization. The real powers of the president when they declare a state of emergency, if you ever go into them, your hair will turn white, right? A president can essentially, for example, make it illegal for anyone to sell you anything, including bread, through presidential declaration, okay? That should not be allowed. It should not be constitutional. It is not safe in the hands of an office where half the time we're getting someone where we don't know what we're getting. We should also do more to reform the process for selecting presidents. Most importantly, what we really need to do is bring the parties back in, right? We have, over generations of reform after reform, hugely weakened the parties and their ability to filter out candidates. So now we do everything through primaries, and I don't want to go back to the old smoke-filled rooms. I don't think that's a good idea. But we should allow the political elites in the parties, the people who know the candidates best and who know the presidency best, a disproportionate vote in saying, not saying who should be the candidate, but we should allow them to say who should not be the candidate, right? So my proposal for this is what I call a negative vote, right? Both parties have super delegates who have official positions. They are party elites, and they should be able to vote against someone. Say you can have anyone you want, but I'm going to cast a vote that cancels out one delegate for this person, and we're just not going any further. So that. And the last one I would say is we need elite responsibility. Right, so I was at, I do a lot of work with the military, and I was at an offsite where I met a fairly prominent Republican. First time I'd met him in my life. Never seen this guy before, right? So I'm not in his circle of trust. This is during the 2016 primaries, and he told me the Republican Party will never nominate Donald Trump because it would be an act of madness, and we're not that crazy. I was like, I don't think you're right about this, but okay. Then Trump got nominated. I follow this guy on Twitter. You have never met a more sycophantic Trump supporter, right? Like, and I would just say, like, we all know people like that. We do. There should be consequences, right? You should say to those people, you sold out your country. You did, right? And like, if Democrats did it, I hope they would hold that to me. I hope they would, right? Like elite accountability really matters. You know, like, to quote the wisdom of Spider-Man, right? Like, with much power comes much responsibility. If you are an American elite, the sort of person who, say, attends the Aspen Ideas Festival, like, you have a responsibility to stand up for the country that has treated you so well. And I gotta say, over the last 6 years, 7 years, a lot of us just fell down on that one. And so the last thing I'd leave you is, you are helping to pick the most powerful person in the world. We gotta do a better job. And we do have the ability to do it. Thanks, everybody.